In episode 7, how Eleanor turned into a vampire, the early days of her being a vampire, Mark and Zeke's relationship breaking down, and what happened to Elizabeth is showcased. So, topic 1 deals with the events that led up to Eleanor's attack and the early days of her being a vampire. Now, what happened? Elizabeth was outside with Eleanor. They were looking at the moon. Meanwhile, Zeke and Mark were inside talking about betters, amongst other things. Elizabeth went inside because she had to go to work and wanted Mark to go outside with his daughter to watch her. During that transition of her trying to get him outside to Eleanor being alone, that is when the vampire was taking out everyone's addresses, seemingly left the sewers because that's how he got around, through sewers, subway lines, even the Amtrak line. And he got into a tree. He snatched Eleanor once Elizabeth left, and he tried to drag her back to the sewers, but Eleanor was loud enough for Mark to hear her, and while he didn't keep her from being attacked, he at least saved her life, that she didn't need the vampire feed. Of course, she's quickly taken to the hospital because she's bleeding and they don't know what attacked her, and that leads to the problem of the doctors not knowing what attacked her either, so naturally rabies is the first thing they try to test for and get antibiotics. But being that Eleanor is quickly becoming pale and looking sickly, that leads to a whole slew of antibiotics being used. And on top of that, an investigation into what attacked her, which of course triggers Mark's mind of the whole idea that, hey, we find the source, we find the antidote. But unfortunately, finding the vampire that attacked Eleanor is something that's not happening, and even 10 years later has not happened. But thankfully, Zeke is watching a bit closer than Elizabeth and Mark are, and he's the first one to recognize that, hey, Eleanor's a vampire. And with that, he's the one who gets her vial of blood and starts the rotation. Elizabeth steps in terms of getting Eleanor out of the hospital so that she, Zeke, and Mark can start, donating on a regular basis, but the problem with trying to do that is Eleanor needs at least a liter of blood every other day. And I think, I could be wrong, and I'll put in a little bar below if it's wrong or not, but I think humans can only donate, is it 1 or 4 pints of blood a day, depending on the person? So clearly, between the three of them, they're not going to have enough blood, especially because from the way it sounds, Eleanor's blood needs to be fresh. It can only be out of a human body for about an hour. And unlike Interview with the Vampire, I don't think that rats and other animals are applicable. It has to be human blood. So the second topic goes into the dissolution of Mark and Zeke's relationship, at least for now, and also Mark's first kill. Now, the original idea for Mark was get the sex offenders list. The first person who's going to get taken out is a guy who violated a 9-year-old. He wanted Zeke to help him, but Zeke wasn't for the idea of murdering someone, so that's strike 1. Strike 2 is Zeke thinking that he'll snitch on Mark. Elizabeth will take his side, and then Mark will stand down from this idea. That's strike 2. Strike 3 is just a realization that as much as Zeke honors being Eleanor's godfather, he's not willing to do what it takes. And with that in mind, perhaps to protect him, Mark decides, to clean his hands of Zeke and have him get the hell out of his house. Now, as for how Elizabeth feels, it's her daughter whose life is on the line. She recognizes that if nothing is done, Eleanor will starve, so she gives Mark advice on how to get things done from a medical perspective, so that not only he gets things done, gets the blood back, but also the chances of him getting caught are minimal. But unfortunately, while Mark does knock the guy out, slit his throat, and get what looks like a milk jug worth of blood, between getting into a car accident on his way out, the guy not letting him go, then the police get involved, the blood gets ruined, so Eleanor refuses to drink it. Which leads us to the last topic, which deals with what happened to Elizabeth. And as you can probably imagine, Mark failed to get blood. Eleanor is starving to death. So Elizabeth decides to lock the door, slit her wrists, and have Eleanor feed from her, seemingly until she, being Elizabeth, died. Which, just to add things up, Mark's guilt comes from leaving Eleanor outside when he should have been with her. He has guilt from not being able to handle the sex offender and getting them handled and getting the blood back to Eleanor. And ultimately, he being part of the reason why his wife died because he failed and she didn't think there was any other way to keep Eleanor alive.
We're home now, Ellie. And we're not going anywhere.
What if this is all I'll ever be?
What are you doing here? Are you in love with me?
I would do anything in my power to protect you.
What if we're all just broken from what happened to us?
They caught me in the middle of a yawn. You imagine that?
So for this episode, we have two highlights. The first one is just how many answers we got to lingering questions. We got answers regarding the events surrounding Eleanor's attack. It wasn't at a Stargazer's field, it was in our own backyard. And on top of that, it was in the split second between Elizabeth going inside and Mark going outside. On top of that, we learned that the way that the vampire who attacked her and also Peter moved about was between sewers, subway lines, Amtrak lines, and that's how he was able to get in and out without being noticed. We also got to see what happens when vampires aren't invited in, and that's bleeding from every orifice. And there's probably more things that got revealed, but I just can't remember them offhand, and it's just... I want to take a moment to recognize that we didn't get any answers regarding Peter and how he got attacked and everything, but at the same time, this show's not really about Peter. It's more so about Eleanor, Isaiah, and their families, so I'm not mad at it. And let's be honest, there's probably not a huge difference because we know the method. We know what happened. Arthur shut things down, started doing testing. Claire was told her brother's dead, so do we really need to see that in the flesh? I don't think so. The second highlight for me is how what we learn in the past could potentially affect the future. Specifically, let's just say that Naomi and Mark become a thing. Likely, he's never going to open up about his wife's death because that would partly deal with revealing what Eleanor is. And Eleanor's not going to reveal that to Naomi. And probably not Isaiah either, just because how would you even talk about killing your mother in order to survive? So with that in mind, her potentially looking into Mark because, maybe she's had a bad string of exes or something like that, and learning that Elizabeth killed herself, I feel that's going to trigger some things. Like, if you go by the preview, she's already going to be on her way to Claire's house to investigate a murder. So imagine learning that Mark's ex-wife killed herself and her trying to dig into what was the reason. That's going to lead to a lot of drama, and I don't know how many episodes are left of this season, but I can fathom that information getting out, it could very well lead to Mark feeling like, I've gotten enough red flags, warning shots, whatever you want to call them. Now is the time when we have to leave. Say goodbye to your godfather. We probably won't see him in a couple of years. Overall, this episode is aptly named More Than You'll Ever Know for while we get so many answers to things, be it how Eleanor became a vampire, the early days, what happened to Elizabeth, and so much more. There's so much that we probably don't even know. We're just getting this little bite-sized piece that I don't know if this is going to become like a seasonal thing. We do one episode taking place in the past or not. Like, season 2 could easily go into the various places that Eleanor and Mark have been to while they've been searching for this vampire, but I'm appreciative of all the answers that are given this episode and how much that can potentially set things up in the future, especially regarding Naomi, who I just feel like she's about to do or say something big in future episodes that is going to really start to shake this show up and definitely make it pick up the pace. And while I don't think we're gonna see the vampire that turned Eleanor anytime soon, at the very least there's some sense of a threat, because with Naomi having to kill somebody and her wanting to really like deserve all the praise that she's been getting, she's going to take things as far as she can with Claire, Matthew, and Peter. And if she may get a reason to move on over to Mark, especially because, lest we forget, she was very uneasy about them when she first met them. So while she may have some type of feelings for him now, if her gut gets a reason to be proven right, it's not just Claire and her family that may go down. It may be Mark's family too, and who knows what that can mean for Eleanor. Especially if this show doesn't decide to stick to the plot of the original, well, I never read the book, but at least I saw the original movie and also the remake. So whether or not Eleanor gets taken down, or once Mark gets taken down, she may run away with Isaiah, it's all up in the air, and it's making the final episodes definitely something interesting.